When Jesus noticed how the guests sought out the best seats at the table, he told them a parable.
When someone invites you to a wedding celebration, don't take your seat in the place of honor. Someone more highly regarded than you could have been invited by your host. The host invited both of you will come and say to you, "Give your seat to this other person." Embarrassed, you will take your seat in the least important place. Instead, when you receive an invitation, go and sit in the least important place. When your host approaches you, he will say, "Friend, move up here to a better seat." Then you will be honored in the presence of all your fellow guests. All who lift themselves up will be brought low, and those who make themselves low will be lifted up.
Then Jesus said to the person who had invited him,
When you host a lunch or dinner, don't invite your friends, your brothers, your sisters, your relatives, or rich neighbors. If you do, they will invite you in return, and that will be your reward. Instead, when you give a banquet, invite the poor, crippled, lame, and blind, and you will be blessed because they can't repay you. Instead, you will be repaid when the just are resurrected.
When one of the dinner guests heard Jesus' remarks, he said to Jesus, "Happy are those who will feast in God's kingdom." Jesus replied,
A certain man hosted a large dinner and invited many people. When it was time for the dinner to begin, he sent his servant to tell the invited guests, "Come, the dinner is now ready." One by one, they all began to make excuses. The first one told him, "I bought a farm and must go and see it. Please excuse me." Another said, "I have bought 5 teams of oxen, and I'm going to check on them. Please excuse me." Another said, "I just got married, so I can't come." Then he returned to the servant. When he returned, the servant reported these excuses to his master. The master of the house became angry and said to his servant, "Go quickly into the city streets, the busy ones, and the side streets, and bring the poor, the crippled, blind, and lame." The servant said, "Master, your instructions have been followed, and there is still room." The master said to the servant, "Go to the highways and the back alleys and urge people to come in, so that my house will be filled. I tell you, not one of those who are invited will taste my dinner."
A couple weeks ago, I went to the Noblesville Chamber of Commerce. It was my second time to be there. I arrived just about the time of the start of the program, maybe a minute or two late. And when I entered the room was full of people. So I quickly surveyed, tried to see if there was anybody I knew or somebody that I'd met at the last meeting. I did spot a couple of our Noblesville First people, but their table was already full. So I looked around and prayed for a sign from God where I should sit. No sign came. So I went and found a table that had a couple of open seats, and I sat down, and I happened to be surrounded by a bunch of financial types. I had to dig deep to find some small talk because market trends and spreadsheets just aren't my thing. And quite honestly, I'm not sure they were all that comfortable sitting next to a pastor. So we survived the evening. The program was, the lunch, the program was good, and afterwards, our Noblesville First friends introduced me to some people, and it was a good, successful event. So tell me, what do when you enter a room that's full of either strangers or so many people you got to decide where you're going to sit? If you're like me, you look first for some friends. And then if you know a lot of people, then you quickly, I'm amazed at how good the mind is at going in strategic planning mode and figuring out who's going to be the most fun to sit down with and communicate, right? And the nice thing is when you come to church, you don't have to worry about that because you all have your selected seats, right? So, well, that describes well the situation that Jesus walked into. And the scriptures are very clear that this is a very important social function. It says that it's held in the home of a leader among the Pharisees. And so what happens in this situation is people are vying for position. And in Middle Eastern culture, whoever sat closest to the host had the greatest place of honor. And this is very important, very significant in those days, because where you sit, your proximity to that host determines your standing in the society and in that community, or perhaps even in that village. And it's also important, if you happen to be in business in that world, your contacts can be extremely important. So where you sit matters. And Jesus notices this jockeying for position. And so he comments on it. And he says in a very friendly way, you might want to think about when you come into a gathering to not vie for that seat next to the host, because this is what could happen. He might see who's around and notice one of his persons that are his real friends and ask him to come, which means you're going to get up and have to move, which would be an incredibly embarrassing situation. That would be hard for us to appreciate, given how much we value equality in our society. But in their day, that would be an act of shame to have to be moved down the line. And then Jesus is even more bold, and he says to the host, and you might want to consider who you are inviting. Because if you invite people that can give you something in return, then you're getting a human reward. But if you want to make God happy, invite some people who have nothing to give back to you. Well, I think the story might have ended right then and there, except there happened to be one man who decides he wants to try to get in good with this new rabbi, Jesus. And so he stands up and very piously he says, happy are those who feast in God's kingdom. Very pious remark. Surely Jesus, the rabbi, will like that. But it's clear that he says it with the expectation that he is one of those who will feast. And Jesus then decides they're not getting the point. While Jesus is trying to widen the table, everybody here is vying for where their seat will be. And so he decides to take this opportunity, this teaching opportunity, a little bit deeper. And he decides to share a parable. Now, I would love to detail out for you, we don't really have the time this morning, how the people in that banquet room would have heard that parable. It would have been a shocking parable for them. I'd love to talk about how important, how sacred an invitation was, because these gatherings of a community were so important to all involved. And to RSVP and then not show up would be simply unexpected. Because remember, they didn't have refrigerators back then. And when you choose the meat that's going to be slaughtered in order to feed, you have to make sure all of it's consumed. So the number that are going to come has to be precise. And you sacrifice the meat that's appropriate. And I'd love to talk about how it would be simply unacceptable to say no to an invitation like this. I would love to detail out how unusual it would be to go out to all the places that people would normally never, ever invite. And all that comes together to shock the people that are there in that banquet meal. They would have been surprised because Jesus was trying to widen that table while they were trying to make it smaller and smaller. I have noticed in my life that it seems that whenever I start to think that I am lightened fully, that my table is wide enough, that God brings along a new revelation. And certainly on this World Communion Sunday, this is a very appropriate time to consider how wide our table is. And confession is good for the soul, right? So it made me think of some times when God has widened my table. And you need to understand that I grew up in Plainfield, Indiana, which in my day was very much a pretty generic, almost fully Caucasian community. We were proud, though, of our diversity. We probably had at least 1% African American. Most of that due to the faculty that worked at the Indiana Boys School. But compared to our neighbors to the north and to the south, we consider ourselves quite advanced. Now, I recall really getting my first exposure to people of a different race when in our circle, our college age Bible study that was in our church, one member of that group started dating an African American. And that was a good experience for me. I discovered that Milton's a fun guy. He fit right in. He was a very dedicated Christian. And I saw how good he was for Sue. And so I began to broaden my horizons a little bit. And then I watched as that relationship got more serious and they chose to get married. And I watched painfully as the father of Sue chose to reject not just Milton, but also his own daughter. He refused to go to the wedding. And how incredibly painful it was. And boy, it made me think about what would I do if one of my daughters decided to date someone from a different race. And I know if you're young that this all sounds silly, but when I was becoming an adult, this was a real issue. It was a challenging one. And so right there, I found my table being widened just a little bit. I also remember not too long ago, a few months ago, I was at Castleton United Methodist Church for a diversity training exercise, which is a requirement of all United Methodist pastors, right? Every 4 years, we have to go to a diversity training. The first time I went, I found it very, very helpful. I appreciated it. The second time, not so much. It was a little annoying. By the third time, I just downright resented having to go. Like I haven't got this figured out yet. And so I went and sat down with my arms crossed, not really expecting to get much out of this. But then Sharon White did something a little different this time. Instead of going through concepts and PowerPoints, she just had us go around the circle and share the first time that we experienced differences in our life. We did 3 rounds of it. We talked about race, we talked about culture, and we talked about religion. And each of us shared different stories. And I found myself listening to that and making some realizations. And it made me recall an experience I had in high school where my friend Doug, who was an African American, one of our few, whom everybody loved. I remember often he was on the basketball team and coming home from a basketball game, he was just a great storyteller. Everybody loved Doug. He just fit right in. We got to the point, I didn't even think about what color his skin was. He was just Doug. But while I'm sitting there listening to that diversity training, I recalled when I went off to IU, to Indiana University, my freshman year, Doug also went to Indiana University. And of course, as big as that campus is, I didn't see Doug for a long time until near the end of the second semester. And all of a sudden, Doug had changed. His hair was different. His clothing was different. His speech was different. His attitude was different. And he didn't seem all that interested in reconnecting with me. And I wondered, what happened to Doug? And then in that diversity training, I made the connection that, oh my gosh, Doug was having to work so hard to fit in with us. He was suppressing who he was. It made me sad at how insensitive we were not even aware of what Doug was having to do just to become one of us. And so my table has gotten a little wider. And I try to be a little more aware and put myself in the shoes of people who have to deal with being a minority in a majority society. And then I also recall experience that challenged me well. When I went off to Nicaragua, 1985, it was an educational experience. I remember going into that situation with kind of I'm up here and they're down there, those poor people, whom life is dismal, desperate, poverty must be extremely tough. And when I went down there, I discovered, gosh, these people are happy. I happened to be there right after they had overthrown a dictatorship, and so they were so excited about participating in their government. They were so excited in the illiteracy that had been reduced incredibly. And I found the children were playing and happy and joyful. There was love, there was hope, and it began to help me realize, which I'm sure many of you will if you're going to Guatemala for the first time, that God is everywhere, and happiness can be found without all the things that we think that we have to have. Again, my table was made just a little wider. So I hope and pray that God is widening your table a little bit more. And I know that it seems like every time when I've got it, I think I've arrived, I think I'm as broad-minded as I possibly can be, God brings along another experience, another revelation that makes my table a little wider. And that's kind of what this Sunday's about, isn't it? This meal that we're to share in, this sacrament, is a meal that in Jesus' day was used often to make friends out of strangers, to make allies out of enemies, in addition to uniting us with God through his Son, Jesus Christ. So on this day when Christians are taking communion all around the world, I hope that it'll help you widen your table just a little bit more. Would you pray with me, please? Dear Lord, we're thankful that you are one who continues to work on us. And we see your hand at work because you have broadened our understandings through the years, through the decades, and yet we still know that we have so far yet to go. Help each one of us face our prejudices, our barriers, our limitations that we place that get in the way of us relating to one another as you intend us to. Bless each person as they struggle with the divisions that sometimes separate families and separate friends, separate nations. This we ask in your name. Amen.